Hi, welcome to Gamba tutorial number 14. This is part 2 in my French viol ornamentation series. In this particular video we're going to look at vibrato and the different kinds of vibrato that were described and notated in the French Baroque pièce de viol. Vibrato has been a bit of a controversial issue to a certain extent in early music because certainly in the later Baroque there are treatises that encourage the use of vibrato, but also ones that discourage it and in fact complain about it. So for example, Gimignani in his treatise on violin playing really encourages the player to use vibrato as often as possible, whereas Leopold Mozart, the father of Wolfgang, in his treatise on violin playing really complains about it, and in fact he says, performers there are who tremble consistently on each note as if they had the palsy. So clearly some people were really against this, but also according to his description, a lot of people were also using a lot of vibrato by that time. Of course, vibrato as an affectation, as a tone colour, is much easier to produce on the violin. On the viol, however, our frets really get in the way of this vibrato that we would now be familiar with from violin playing, because the frets impede the changing, the alteration of the pitch, and in fact that's what they're for. That's what allows us to play such amazing chordal music. However, that's not to say that vibrato wasn't used. It was. The French, in fact, were quite prescriptive about their use of vibrato and found ways to annotate it, to notate it in their music. It was considered, in fact, really to be a kind of trill, and in quite a few of the treatises, especially those by D'Anneville, de Machy's preface to his pièce, and Jean Rousseau, they use terminology that's very similar to that which describes trills. And as such, vibrato was considered a rhetorically very affective ornament. It was considered one that was very passionate. So you find, certainly in the music of Marin, you find the use of vibrato much more commonly in his slower, more passionate pieces. And a bit later we're going to be looking at some examples from Maret's Tombeau pour Monsieur de Saint-Colomb. French viol composers used two different types of vibrato. The first is something that's much more familiar to modern listeners, and is a vibrato using just one finger. The second type of vibrato is rather more bizarre to our modern ears, and is a vibrato using two fingers, which produces a much wider variation in pitch, but is also really quite expressive and used for very special occasions by French composers. And these two types of vibrato, of course, as with many other French ornaments, had varied names and varied descriptions and varied symbols across all the various composers. But those adopted by Maret have been adopted by modern players as the standard names and forms and symbols of these types of ornaments. So those are the ones I'm going to concentrate on in this session. Maret described the single finger vibrato as a plainte and the two-finger vibrato as a flatement. De Machy uses different terminology. He describes the single finger vibrato as the aspiration, and in fact he compares it to the miaulement described by Robert de Vicey, who was a theorbo player and a colleague of de Machy. And Vicey's term miaulement actually means the meowing of a cat, interestingly enough. And for the two-finger vibrato, he describes this as the tremblement sans appuyer, so the trill without a lean. So interestingly, that he really does consider this a trill, or a form of trill. Saint-Colomb also uses a symbol that is almost certainly a form of flatement, a two-finger vibrato, which is a wavy line. It's also important to note that notated vibrato exists outside, and in fact probably predates the French viol tradition. For example, Christopher Simpson describes a vibrato, a type of vibrato which he calls the close shake, and again is a sort of form of trill. He groups it in with as a type of trill, and again uses two fingers to create this quite wide variation in pitch. And while most French composers use this ornament very specifically and actually rather sparingly, in his treatise, Jean Rousseau describes the vibrato as imitating a certain gentle agitation of the voice on the tone. And he says this is why it's practiced in all situations when the value of the note permits. It must last as long as the note. Now that suggests, rather like Gimignani, that he wanted it to be performed on every note. But we have to remember that Jean Rousseau seems to be teaching his students to improvise ornamentation in music that doesn't have any ornamentation notated, which was a practice that really fell out of fashion. Certainly the music of Marais, Forqueray, Quai de Valois, all of these composers really specified exactly where you should use the vibrato. Though you could take this as reason to add extra vibrato in other music, for example. So to get to the performance of these things, the main vibrato ornament seems to have been the flatement. So that's the ornament with using two fingers. So the way that's performed is you stick two fingers together. So let's say you're playing on the second fret with your first finger. You press the finger down as you normally would, but you stick your next finger, your second finger, right up against the first finger. And then with a rocking motion, so you oscillate the pitch, and it doesn't quite reach the next note, but you'll hear that the pitch bends. And the way to achieve this is to rock the forearm in an arc, starting closer to the scroll and moving towards the bridge and then back again. So it's not a sort of twisting or it's quite a slow motion. It's not side to side. It's the bridge to scroll, and it's actuated by the forearm. And it's necessary to make quite a wide movement in order to make the change in pitch really obvious. If we don't move enough, it's not very obvious. And the idea behind this ornament is to create a really impassioned sort of pitch change that really strikes the ear. We can find some really good examples of the use of vibrato and flatement in Marais' Tombeau pour Monsieur de Saint-Colomb. Of course, this is a very, very passionate, very sad piece. And interestingly, he starts the piece with the flatement, very much in keeping with French poetry, tombeaus and poetry that's particularly passionate, where poets would choose particularly long words that were considered grammatically long, such as Dieu or O or A. And he applies this flatement. So the beginning is really rather dramatic. The first note is an E. So as I described earlier, you use your first finger, stick your second finger to it, and then rock your hand from scroll to bridge. So it's a really arresting start to the piece. And because the flatement is really closely tied to the trill, you can vary the speed of the oscillations, starting slow in imitation in a way of the leaned note on the beginning of a tremblement avec appui, and gradually speeding up to increase the intensity. Now, on the downbeat of the next bar, we find a leaning note, a port de voix, followed by a C sharp. And the C sharp has, instead of the horizontal wavy line, which Marais uses to annotate the flatement, he has a vertical wavy line. And this is actually a bit of an unusual example of this type of ornament, this type of vibrato. This is a plainte, so a single finger vibrato. So here, instead of using two fingers, he simply wants you to play what we would consider a regular vibrato. Now, because of the fret, it's much harder to hear, it's much less obvious, much more subtle. And perhaps that's because he wanted the opening to be much more arresting than the following material. But again, in order to vibrate with just a single finger, it's the same movement using the forearm to move the hand towards the bridge and away from the bridge in a sort of arcing motion. And you need to make sure that your finger isn't really stuck down really hard, so that your finger can rock across the pad of the finger and onto the fret. So you want to actually almost go over the fret, but not quite. So your finger needs to be right up against the fret in order for this to work. Now, I say this is unusual, an unusual location for the plant, because normally Marais uses the plant only where it's not possible to use two fingers. So namely, when you're playing something that has to be played with your fourth finger. So to clarify this, if we move a little bit later in the piece, he writes a series of sort of exclamatory passages and short note, long note, and each of the long notes has a vibrato. So you'll see this in the first bar, he moves E to A at the top fret, and of course one has to play that with the fourth finger, and he writes the vertical wavy line, so the plant. So you have to play a vibrato with a single finger, just your fourth finger. And that's because you can't use any other finger to do a flatement, of course. You're stuck with just your fourth finger. Interestingly, in higher positions where the frets are smaller, the vibrato effect is much more obvious. Again, in the next bar, there's another fourth finger vibrato. We play D to G. Again, we can't play a flatement there. But in the next bar, we can, because we're playing the long note with the third finger, the F sharp. So we go... much more obvious vibrato. Again, I'm sticking my fourth finger to my third finger in order to play that. And again, in the next bar. And then we go back to using a plant where we play the D, the long D, minim D, with our fourth finger. And then we're back to flatement. And again. So the whole passage should sound something like this. It's a really very, very plaintive sound. It's also worth noting that vibrato above the frets is much more obvious when using only a single finger. Of course, like on the violin or the cello, there are no frets in the way. So again, you're using the forearm to rock the hand from bridge to scroll, rocking using the pad of the finger to maximize the contact with the string and bend the pitch. So that's essentially all there is to vibrato. There are two types: the plant single finger vibrato, the flatement double finger vibrato, and the intensity of the vibrato can be increased and decreased by speeding up and slowing down the oscillations using the speed of the rocking hand. And it can be a really effective and really very, very moving effect to master, and one that's absolutely essential for French music, especially the sarabande, the allemande, tombeau, pieces where there's really intense passions and slow harmonic movement. Yeah, I hope you found that useful. If you'd like to commission some tutorial videos or access my Music -1 service, You can find more information at samstadlen.co.uk. I'll put the email address in the description box below. And I will see you in the next video.